Hello, dear listeners. I am Anna Tider, and this is Thank You, Mama. And before we jump into this week's interview, I wanted to share with you a podcast I just discovered. It's called The Pumping Podcast, and its host, Jessica Lorian Martinez, interviews women about different aspects of motherhood, from combining motherhood with a career, struggling with infertility, staying fit, sleep, and as one episode title perfectly says, all the shit nobody tells you. Jessica is very charming and her guests are open and sweet. I got hooked. It will remind you that you are not alone and make you feel stronger and more inspired as a mother and as just you. So look it up. I will share a link in my episode notes. Hi, my name is Anna Tider, and this is Thank You, Mama. My guest today is Caitlin Leffel. Caitlin, did I pronounce that right? I'm struggling with your second name because I want to call you Leffel.
It was perfect. All pronunciations are perfect.
Great. Caitlin is a writer, a co-author, and editor of several awesome lifestyle books. Caitlin is born and raised in New York City. She still lives in New York City. And Caitlin used to be an editor for Rizzoli, which makes those gorgeous, gorgeous big coffee table books, where she worked on a lot of fun topics, such as Manolo Blahnik and Yves Saint Laurent and Diana Vreeland. And then Caitlin collected her courage, and I applauded her for that, and just jumped off into her own. Now she's a freelance editor, and I'm very excited about that because every time I talk to Caitlin about her work, she has amazing projects going on. Caitlin, tell us about it.
Well, thank you, Anna, for that introduction. I tend to use the phrase that I kicked myself out of the nest. Rizzoli was a very comfortable, nesty place, but I was too comfortable and I needed to grow and fly and, spread my wings, as they say. And I should make one clarification, which is that Rizzoli is still a client of mine. I still work for them. I just don't, or still work with them. I just don't work for them anymore. And I also wanted to do more writing than I was able to do when I had a demanding day job. So I think a big part of it for me was I always worked with words. I was always very good with words and languages. But I did an MFA program, and I looked down the barrel of the gun of writing a memoir or a novel, and I was like, absolutely not. That sounds terrible, like really isolating and hard and emotional. So instead, I've really gotten into working on, as you mentioned, co-authoring and ghostwriting, because it's like all the things I like about writing and language with none of the serious ego, why does my story need to be in the world parts.
But tell me about, you're working on really fun projects right now.
My projects are my benefits package. It's a big part of why I love my job is I get to work on such interesting subjects with such accomplished people. What I'm working on right now that I just adore is called The New Cucina Italiana. And it is about the young chefs who are shaking up Italian cuisine, written by a fantastic journalist who knows this movement inside and out, named Laura Lazzaroni. I'm also editing a book on the history of jewelry. It's actually the history of the world through jewelry with an amazing woman, Celine Volandes, who's the editor-in-chief of Town & Country and a big jewelry expert.
I can't wait for that one.
This fall it's going to be at how do you choose your favorite child? It's going to be very difficult. I won't choose between them. They are both fantastic. And then I'm writing an interiors book now, and also writing 2 cookbooks now, which I can't really say that much more about. So yeah, that's the never a dull moment at Self-Employed HQ over here.
Caitlin, I want to slowly get into the direction of your mama.
Mm-hmm.
Through the fun story with the Oscar.
Oh,
I namely walked into your apartment in New York City, and went straight to your bookcase, as I normally do. And there was standing a real Oscar statue. And that was very surprising because it's a real Oscar, and you were an editor and writer. Your mom, I knew, was in books. Nobody was in the film industry. My mom was a movie star, and I've spent last 10 years in Hollywood, very close to all of that. Never held a real Oscar in my hand. And then I walk into your apartment and there's the Oscar. And I'm like, Caitlin, why do you have an Oscar? And you say, it's my mom's.
Well, I just thank you for asking me that question. I just want to say that whenever I hesitated about being nervous about being on this podcast, about talking about my mom and lots of feelings, I thought, but the one thing is I'm going to get to tell the Oscar story, and lots of people are going to get to hear the Oscar story. And I was like, that's a good incentive. So the Oscar did belong to my mom, and she won it, got it, for being friends with somebody before I was born in the 70s, who had a boyfriend who had defected from the Hungarian national soccer team and ended up working at the factory in Queens where they produced the Oscars, where I believe they still produce them today. And my mom was a really big movie fan, and he knew it. So he stole one for her birthday one year. And it played a big part in my childhood. As I said, my mom was a big movie fan. We didn't really have Oscar parties, but we always had people over for the Oscars. It was the one night a year that I was able to stay up late. I ran the Oscar ballot for a number of years, collecting everybody's votes, like long before I was able to see the movies myself. And I used to practice my pretend Oscar speeches I would get the screenwriting Oscar, of course, holding it up. And
he's heavy.
Yeah, that's what everyone says when they pick him up. The Oscars are surprisingly heavy. Fun fact, I believe this is still true, that they're produced in Queens, but they're cast in gold in Los Angeles, in Hollywood somewhere. So there was something happened, maybe it was 10 years ago, where the truck with the Oscars was held up and Oscars were stolen, and all of those Oscars, they were saying, would be uncast Oscars. And so the thing was like, well, if you see someone with an uncast Oscar, they probably got it off of whatever, however those people sold it. But my uncast Oscar came from not exactly an honest source, but a different source. It is my favorite possession. Every once in a while I'll have a party and someone will just notice it. But I also make sure I point it out to pretty much anyone who comes to my apartment.
Such an amazing thing to have at home.
Yeah.
So tell us about your mom.
So my mom, her name was Victoria Elizabeth Power. She was born on December 31st, 1945, and she died the day after July 4th in 2005. She did not do anything in an undramatic way, I should say. She really lived up to her name, not exactly in size. She was less than, just barely 5 feet tall and never weighed more than 89 or 90 pounds in her life. But she was a force of personality. I remember at her funeral, her best friend, who had been her college roommate, saying that she had heard that her roommate was going to be someone named Victoria Power, and she imagined someone very grand and imposing. And she meets the little shrimp that my mother was, but she was just as grand and she was just as imposing and intimidating, or even more so, despite her small size. She was incredibly smart, incredibly opinionated, incredibly well-read, incredibly opinionated. I mean, it bears repeating. Had opinions on things that she knew a lot of things about, and had opinions about things she knew nothing about. And very much, she had a very magnetic personality, but it was my way or the highway. I say this with a bit of affection, but I really perceive her as the original Mean Girl. I mean, just someone that everyone kind of wants to be friends with, is sort of mystified by, but is knows her power and knows how to manipulate people and make them feel in the club or out of the club. She was very much like that.
So she was born and raised and lived in New York City just like you did, and she worked in books like you.
She was not born in New York City. She was born in a suburb outside of New York, but could not wait to get to the big city. She did end up working in books. She worked for a literary agent when she finally moved to New York after, I guess, a rather bumpy, varied career, varied time at a couple of different colleges. She just ended up back in the city where she had wanted to be, and worked for a literary agent who specialized in foreign rights, so the rights between England and the UK in what are like called penguin paperbacks, so those orange spined books. And in fact, in the apartment I grew up in, that my father still lives in, there's a beautiful, complete bookshelf of all vintage orange spine penguin paperbacks. I would not dare to take one out now because I'm sure the pages would just crumble in your hand, but it looks really good.
And then she got married. So she was working in the literary agency. Then she got married and she had you and your brother.
Yeah, so I think she met my father when she was probably about 31, and they got married when she would have been, I think, 33, and I was born when she was 35 or 36, and my brother when she was 37 or 38. And then after we were born, she stopped working when I was born, and she did not go back to work anywhere until many years later, until we were much older. And when she did, it was not to go back to a literary agency, but she ended up working at a bookstore. That was a great job for her, because one of the things about working in a small bookstore is that you can, as I understand it, a lot of her work was just telling people exactly what they should read and berating them for reading anything that she did not think was what they should be reading.
And then we talked about how she was not very happy in this situation.
Yeah, I mean, I think, one of the things about losing a parent before you're super adult. I mean, I was 24 when my mom died, but I was not yet sort of reflective about adulthood. I knew she was unhappy from not a super young age, but a relatively young age, or she was often unhappy. Part of it, I think, was not even necessarily a bit of a resentment. I think she did really love her job as a literary agent, and it was a different time. I don't know that she really would have been able to go back to work, and, who would have picked us up from school and things like that. But I think when I'm very honest about it, I think she was also just a very unhappy and depressed person. And one thing that contributed to that was that while I always felt extremely loved, I became aware when I was a little older that I think she resented being a mother. I think she resented a lot of the banalities of it. I think she really loved us and had strong feelings about my brother and I, but I don't think she took really any joy in being a mother.
But it's interesting, Caitlin, and it's so important to accept the fact that not everybody's life fulfillment is being a mother, And this is why I admire women who recognize that and dare to say, this is not for me. And I know they stand under a lot of social pressure. You made me read that fantastic book, Motherhood, about the writer who was trying to decide if she should have children or not.
Sheila Heti. Anyone who's listening to this podcast, Go read that book.
Go read it. It's fantastic. I disliked it while I was reading it. It was unnerving me a little bit, but it just stuck with me. And I think that's what a good book does. But I'm curious to hear if there's a lesson in this, because you decided in a way to not become a mom.
Yeah, I think there is. I mean, I think a parent can influence you in ways that are becoming like them, not becoming like them, by their presence, by their absence. I think that's influence is not, I do this, so you then will do that. And especially, I think, with something like a real lived experience of a parent, maybe you don't perceive everything when you're a child, but you can go back and look and you figure some things out. And while some things that happen in your life are, for many people, are well out of their control, there are some things you have a degree of control over. And when I was in my kind of early 30s, and I had been married for quite some time and was thinking about like, are we going to have children or not? I went through many different exercises. I gamed out lots of different situations. I weighed every pro and con, and I would not say that my mom's influence was the only reason that I came out on the side of not pursuing having a child. But I think it's the most significant, because what the lesson wasn't, to me, the lesson wasn't, if you have kids, you're probably going to be miserable. It's that if you do have kids, like that's not a guarantee of a really happy and fulfilled life. Like that anything could happen, right?
That is so important. It's such a fantastic lesson. We've never had that one, and it's very, very important. I think that women are still pushed into believing that once you have kids, it's all okay. I spoke to a sociology professor, and she said she named it projecting fairy tale endings. Like you just have to get married and have kids, and then everything's going to be awesome. We have to get out of that.
Yeah, and I want to be really clear about the distinction between the two things, right? The distinction of like, I felt like my mother didn't like being a mother, so I shouldn't do it. It was very much more the other more complicated, like sort of murkier version of that, which is it's just not a guarantee. And so don't assume that that's the happy ending. Like it poked holes in that for me. And I think I was a little bit haunted by that too. I think also it made me, when I got to the point of really not having children, it's not a coincidence that it coincided with my kicking myself out of the nest, as I said, my previous job, where I felt like if I had to make my time on the planet somehow meaningful if I wasn't going to have children. And so that's kind of a thing that I like, it's meaningful to me. Like I'm not saving lives with my books, but I do something that I'm very passionate about. And I think I'm helping to bring interesting things into the world and things like that. I did not decide to become a superhero or like, I don't know, make world peace. But I do think that also goes back to, I think part of my mother's big frustration was that she was so smart. And I don't think that she had been like such a good student, like she wasn't going to be a doctor or lawyer anyway, probably, but she was so smart and not working and doing like a lot of kid stuff, I think was really, really, really stifling to her.
Do you think that lack of her professional fulfillment was also in a way a lesson for you, and this is why you are so ambitious and successful and independent and pushing your profession?
So I think yes. I also think that I mean, because my mother died when I was in my relatively early 20s, the independence a lot comes from not having, I had such a strong mother. My mother was such a big influence just because she was so opinionated. She was like, she just sucked up all the air into any room that she was in, and was a very magnetic personality. And then, then after going through grief, like there was like quite a power vacuum in my life, I guess. And so it's not that I had been unindependent before, or dependent. Sorry, editor should really use better words, real words. But it did open me up to, she had a lot of strong opinions. Sorry, I should finish that sentence. I think it did make me a more independent professionally. And it also freed me in this very bittersweet way to do things that I knew that she had disapproved of. And so I might not have done otherwise. And so the big example of that is that I had been thinking, I talked openly, just musing once or twice about going to graduate school for writing when I was in my early 20s. And I should just add one thing. I'm not a great artist, but I graduated from college at a time when like nobody was getting jobs. And I knew all these people that had like gotten really, really expensive degrees, like law degrees, and then they couldn't pay off their student loans. They couldn't get jobs. And I thought at least, something with writing, which I was like actually kind of good at, you could also teach. And there were some things that in my like young 20s brain seemed more like stable, like actually seemed kind of stable and reasonable. Even though I think I was kind of wrong about some of those things, but she was like, you can't teach someone how to write, only it's the genius, it's the inspiration. Like she was really like, I think I only brought it up once, but I remember how against it she was. And so a few years after she died, my grandmother died. And because my mother was no longer alive, I got a little bit of money from her. And I totally used it to go to graduate school for writing. Arguably, I mean, I think it was a totally fine choice. And I loved my school, and it did like change my life in a lot, in a lot of ways. I don't regret doing it at all. I only sometimes think about, I mean, it wasn't that much money, but I'm just like, I could have done some other really interesting things with that money.
I think you did the best. You definitely chose the best. You chose your passion.
Yeah. Well, and I felt it very poignantly that like I was doing it just for me. And it was the first thing. It probably wasn't actually the first thing, but it was it's not that I wouldn't have been able to. I could have like gotten student loans or something, but I don't think I would have done it without that. Right. And so it felt very me centric, and doing something that I knew my mother was so against did actually feel very good. I can't lie. Like it did feel kind of great. I mean, this was several years after she died. So this was probably 3 years. It was 3 years after she died. So it wasn't like, it's not like I did it the next day.
Caitlin, she does not sound like she was the easiest person to be around. Mm-hmm. And you are such an amazing person to be around. Do you think that too was a lesson from your mom? Do you think that having a relatively difficult person as a mom was shaping you in some form?
Yeah. I mean, I think sort of like what I said before is that a parent is an influence in any number of ways. And although I also believe parents who are not present can be big influences, when you live with someone, you see a lot. And my mother is was much more, she had quite a special bond with my brother, who also has struggled a lot with things like being unhappy. And whereas I'm a relatively happy person. I like people. I try to avoid conflict, not run into it.
But that's interesting. You see, this is a lesson learned from watching your mom.
Yeah. And she really did. Like she liked fighting. Like she liked conflict. I really associate it with like being miserable. And I like being calm and kind of even and, perhaps to a fault, like don't resolve issues with people openly and like just try to like resolve them internally. She would pick fights that in my opinion didn't need to happen. She was very openly emotional. She cried and yelled and I'm not really like that. So I do think it's a little bit of a balance of nature and nurture. I do think that I am more like my father. Like I've been born with a nature. I feel incredibly grateful that I don't have that dark cloud that makes people like my mom suffer for their whole lives. I think that's the lottery that I won from birth, really. I do think about that. But I also, I think there is a nurture part of it too. And like I see in my life that I gravitate in my friends towards people who are like me and more even, and people who are more volatile, I either like struggle with or just want to fix them, right? Whatever. I was like an unpleasant teenager too. Like, let's not let me totally off the hook. I was pretty unpleasant to live with between the ages of about 12 and 15. But when I was older, I loved the college that I went to. I did not go to school in New York, but I went to school in quite rural Massachusetts, like a grass trees and bricks and a football team. And like, it was perfect it was the best thing I could do was sort of get away and be somewhere nice and quiet. But it did sort of come back, and having grown up a bit, I really had a lot of compassion for my mom, like that I really just saw that she really just struggled with unhappiness. And I thought that was really like, we had lots of fun times too, but like I'm really grateful that I haven't had it as hard as she has.
Caitlin, and then she was diagnosed when you were young. You were 22 or so.
I was 23 when she was diagnosed, and she died almost exactly a year later.
And you told me how she decided not to have any treatments, which I admire a lot. I feel very guilty now that we pushed my mom into treatments, and it did not help, and we knew they won't help. I think we were trying to buy time. But anyway, we were talking about how your mom owned her death, how she was just as dignified and strong in her death as she was in her life.
So when she was diagnosed with a very difficult cancer that didn't really have it wasn't going to have a good outcome anyway. She was like, well, my choices are like go to chemo and live miserably for like a couple more months, or just continue living my life until I can't anymore. And so she chose the second one, which is, I mean, in my opinion, the right choice.
Yes, but such a hard choice to make.
Yeah, such a hard choice. And I was 23. I was really mad at her. Like I was like, why don't you want to be around to see me and my brother really grow up and go to our weddings and hold your grandkids? Well, she has one grandkid from my brother, but and like be with us. Like, how could you leave us? Right. And when I think about that now, all I see is how selfish that is. I really do. And not that I am mad that I would feel that way. It's actually a natural way to feel, especially when you're just, you're still kind of like not quite launched yet. But I do see that as like, that's so selfish, right? Like it was her life. I had my whole life ahead of me. My brother does too.
How amazing is that lesson, Caitlin? I think I learned that from my mom. I think we talked about it because she had her first diagnosis 3 years before her death, and she was diagnosed with colon cancer that she got rid of. And once she was in the clear, she told me she was ready to go. She said she was tired. She lived such a full life, and she did so much and experienced so much and worked so hard and loved hard and had me and everything else. And she was just at ease with the idea of just going. And I was so upset about that. I felt betrayed and, like you say, angry that she would be willing to leave me.
Yeah.
But only after she was gone, I learned to respect and understand that at the end of the day, it's our choice.
Right.
Even as a mother of children, it's, in a way, you're right. It's your right to leave when it's your time to leave. And now the question is, do you do it with dignity or do you struggle and fight it,
So my mother's position was that, there are a couple of things, but one of them is like me too, like a number of people, she did not like doctors' offices. She did not like the idea of like she wanted to actually feel okay, do the things that she liked, which by the way, weren't like going to Paris and Japan and, at least she like just wanted to live her life and like do her walks and go to movies and continue working and read the books, and like all the things that she liked to do for as long as she could before she couldn't do them. It's where a little bit the point in my life where, of course, I start thinking of my mother as a person and not just a mother, right? At the time I was still thinking, I was so angry that she was going to leave us, but just as a person, of course, like being absolutely sick and in pain for like another couple of months, just so you could maybe see, I don't know, my brother graduate from college or something. I get, I understand why a person would want to make that choice. And that said, I'm not sure I could do that. I still think it's the right one, but I'm not sure that I could do it. My mother died at home. Which I just read a New York Times article talking about how much more common this is now. And ultimately, the hardest thing I've experienced in my life, particularly the last 6 weeks, she stayed alive longer than anyone thought. And the last 6 weeks were very difficult. But when I think about now, being in a hospital, not being in a familiar space, I shudder to think about that. And I think that choice to get into hospice, to have home hospice, to to be in your own familiar surroundings, to have family that's there 24 hours a day in your own bed. That's as hard as it was. And as much as I saw things and I saw my mother deteriorate in ways that I don't actually like, I really honestly have blocked them out because it's too upsetting to think like they're gone.
I know.
But imagine the alternative of a hospital. But I did, I saw and I learned a lot about what does happen to someone at the end and like how that decline goes, and about how I think also to me, like a sort of a major lesson starting from when she said, I don't want any treatment. I brought up that she was a control freak because it had never occurred to me for how much of the intellectual component of an extended illness is just a continual loss of control and personhood. And that's inevitable. Like in that situation, it's inevitable. But if they can control the things that they control. So my mother could say, I do not want to be in a hospital. I will like to have fewer, better days in my life. I want to choose my mother had esophageal cancer, and a horrible thing that happens is the tumor closes your throat. So you can't eat or consume anything anymore. And she went from, just solid food to milkshakes. Oh my God, I still can't have milkshakes anymore. Post-traumatic stress syndrome, to sorbets, then one day she called me and she could still speak at that point. And she said, just want you to know, I'm not having anything anymore. I'm done with this. I never want to have another sorbet again in my life. I never want to see another milkshake again in my life. I was on that at that point. But she decided it, right? Like she brought it down, and she was able, as things were taken away from her by her illness, she was able to find ways to continue to not sort of like the opposite of holding on to herself, but by letting go of, by letting go of things first, by putting down these lines, she maintained more of herself and more of dignity than if she had just clung to eating and making sure like her hair was perfect and things like that. So I found it incredibly noble, and I think about it all the time.
Crazy how many lessons there are in death, isn't it? That's a whole other podcast. But I wanted to talk to you about another point, which I found always interesting with you. Since I've known you, I heard you mention a few times, you would say two things. You would say, I hate people saying your mom would have been proud of you. And you told me how you hate when other people try to parent you.
Yeah, those two things they're not exactly the same, but they are definitely related. And I do say them. I do say them quite a bit. I mean, I'll start with the first one. So usually if someone says that to you, it's someone who did know your parent, whether it's super well or, tangentially well. And that is very frustrating to me. I think for me, for my own what I think is my own particular situation, because my mother was so opinionated. And in fact, I have no idea what she would think of my life, my choices. I don't think that I've done nothing to think that she would have abandoned me, but it is incredibly possible that we would not necessarily be on the best terms, or that she would really disapprove of the fact, I don't know, that I have never really had a full-time job and always been freelance, or that I do things that are maybe not intellectual. She would think that the books that I work on aren't intellectual enough. Or, I mean, I could think of a million things. She also could very well be proud of me, but I find that in particular gets under my skin, I think, because my mother was so opinionated, and she did exhibit such strong opinions and approvals and disapprovals throughout my childhood, that I could see that becoming, I could see us clashing a lot as I became an adult. I think the second part, I wonder if it's quite universal among people who've lost parents, especially the longer it goes on. So my mother, both my parents had lost parents. One of the few things they really had in common was they had both lost parents when they were 13, 14. And my mother lost her father. But by the time I was born, my grandmother had been remarried. She got remarried when my mother was in college, or just out of college. And I asked my mother one day why she didn't call the person I called granddad, why she called him John. And she said to me, because I had a father and I loved him very much and he died a long time ago and John is not my father. I think about that all the time, that like, I think I do that too, like as difficult as my mother could be. Obviously, I loved her very much. And I feel like she parented me in this incredibly specific, I mean, as anyone, every parent is unique, but this very specific way. And I find myself really bristling when, through incredibly good intent, I can feel someone else trying to mother me or stand in. I would rather stand alone, right? Of all the comfort that I can think that I would want in the world, that's not one that I want.
Caitlin, this is such a beautiful message to end our interview.
Standing alone in the world.
Standing alone in the world.
I'd rather stand alone in the world
than being pampered by people I didn't ask to pamper me.
Yes, the childless woman standing alone in the world. That can be my legacy on this podcast.
Thank you so much.
There's no one else I would rather / probably have been able to bare my soul and dive that deep as I could with you. So consider that a compliment, my dear friend and interviewer extraordinaire. I don't know. I can't think of anyone else I would have done this for.
Thank you so much. I'm so flattered and so honored and so excited about our conversation. It was very special to me because we are friends and we are both now motherless daughters and talk about that a lot. And it really, this one really means a lot to me. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
If you enjoy Thank You Mama and want to help it grow, please take the 2 seconds to leave a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts. It really helps. If you'd like to get in touch, you can send me a mail at info@thankyouMama.net. You can also find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter under Anna Teider, that's Tajder. This was Thank You Mama. Come back next week, subscribe, and tell your friends.